August 1944, Camp Hearne, Texas. Heat wavered above the road as olive-drab 1 to 2 ton CCKW trucks downshifted past mesquite and wire. In the open beds, German prisoners, Afrika Korps veterans beside men taken in Sicily and at St. Lo, watched the guards' M1 Garands and braced for the blow their briefings had promised. The air said otherwise. It carried wood smoke and rendered fat, the low crackle of oak coals, and a sweetness that did not belong to punishment. When the convoy halted, that smell thickened until it was almost visible. A blue ribbon of smoke drifting from open pits toward a stand of live oaks. They climbed down in order, boots scuffing caliche, expecting truncheons and finding instead a long table of bread, beans and beef turning over steel grates. So a trick, one man from Bremen would later write, convinced it would end with ridicule. It did not. Military police stood back, slings easy, while ranchers in sweat-dark hats carved and served. Portions were measured the way the 1929 Geneva Convention required, calories counted, dignity observed, yet the gesture felt larger than any rule, as if the oak smoke itself were arguing a case about what victory should look like. The first bites were guarded, then unstoppable, char at the rim, pink at the center, salt waking a hunger they had trained themselves to ignore. Silence loosened into puzzled nods. A few risked a second helping and were waved forward. No barked orders, no cold barracks. Only smoke, meat, and the odd relief of swallowing without fear. What brought enemies to one table in Texas had begun long before this afternoon, in rail cars, ration charts, and War Department plans that turned decency into policy. The next section follows that machinery from Washington paper to Texas ground. By 1943, the war that spanned oceans had reached deep into the American interior. The United States, once insulated by distance and faith in isolation, had transformed into a vast machine of logistics and labor, its every acre drafted into the effort. Alongside the smokestacks and assembly lines that armed the world, a quieter network took shape, nearly 500 prisoner-of-war camps scattered from Maine to California. More than 400,000 Axis captives crossed the Atlantic under escort of Liberty ships and destroyer screens, not to prison, but to paradox, a captivity that looked more like community. Texas, with its endless rangeland and surplus of sun, became the heart of this system. Nearly 70 camps rose across the state, from the pine thickets of Camp Hearne to the clay plains of Hearne. Camp Swift and Camp Bowie. Barbed wire ringed them, but beyond those fences stretched cotton, corn, and cattle pastures waiting for hands. America no longer had to spare. The rules of their confinement were not improvised. The Geneva Convention of 1929, ratified long before the first shot of the war, required humane treatment, equal rations, medical care, and pay matching that of equivalent U.S. ranks. The War Department enforced it with bureaucratic precision, not out of sentiment, but strategy. Every steak served in Texas was a form of insurance, proof that Allied prisoners held in Germany might one day be fed the same. Yet rules on paper have a way of becoming something more once human faces fill their margins. The military police assigned to guard enemy aliens soon saw soldiers, not symbols. Texan farmers saw laborers who whistled Schubert as they repaired barns and plowed soil. Some townspeople even found them courteous, industrious, strangely familiar. But the truce of civility was fragile. Local newspapers still printed headlines of atrocities in Europe. Families with sons fighting in France watched the POW trucks pass and wondered if mercy was treason. In church pews and feed stores, whispers lingered, should enemies eat so well? And yet, as autumn came, the contradictions of war, charity beside vengeance, fire beside fellowship, would kindle into something wholly unexpected. The road from duty to decency would lead straight to the smell of smoke and the first shared meal beneath Texan skies. By the spring of 1943, a few miles north of Bryan, Texas, the hum of diesel engines and the clang of shovels broke the quiet rhythm of farm life. On a flat stretch of prairie bordered by mesquite and red clay, Camp Hearne rose almost overnight, rows of wooden barracks, a barbed wire perimeter, and a watchtower whose spotlight swept fields better known for cotton than conflict. Officially, it was one of America's first prisoner-of-war installations built under the War Department's engineering division. Unofficially, it would earn a nickname whispered with disbelief, the Fritz Ritz. Within months, the camp's 250 acres housed more than 4,000 German soldiers, most of them veterans of the Afrika Korps, captured after the collapse of Tunisia in May 1943. They had marched through dust storms and shellfire for months. Now they arrived in Texas, sunburned, gaunt, and certain that defeat meant degradation. Instead, their first welcome came in paper cups of cold lemonade and the brisk efficiency of army medics who cleaned and dressed their wounds. The barracks were Spartan but dry. Each row had electric light, proper stoves and showers fed by water tanks that steamed in the afternoon heat. Meals followed U.S. Army standards: meatloaf, potatoes, cabbage, and thick coffee that astonished men who had survived on turnips and black bread. Some POWs thought it a trap, a prelude to interrogation through comfort. Yet as days passed, nothing harsher came. The guards, mostly young Texans barely out of high school, addressed them as fellows, sometimes sharing cigarettes or jokes in broken German. To locals passing by on the road to Hearne, the sight was disorienting. Uniformed Germans lounging in the sun, reading or tending small vegetable plots. Rumor turned reality into legend, and soon Fritz Ritz stuck. Inside the wire, discipline softened into routine. Workshops turned scrapwood into toys and furniture. Our theater rose from salvaged boards, where captured soldiers performed Goethe and Schiller, to applause from both sides of the fence. For many, it was their first glimpse of Americans, not through the lens of propaganda, but proximity. Men capable of laughter and fairness in equal measure. Still, not everyone beyond the barbed wire saw civility as virtue. Families with sons buried in North Africa or Sicily bristled at reports of German comfort. In the cafes of Hearne and the pages of the Bryan Eagle, questions sharpened. Why should killers of Americans enjoy steak and sunshine? The answer, though unwritten, would emerge in the uneasy encounters soon to follow, when the walls between captor and captive began, quietly, to thin. By the summer of 1943, the Texas sun beat down on fields that stretched to the horizon, and for the first time in memory, there weren't enough hands to bring the crops in. The war had drained the countryside. Farmers' sons were in uniform, tractors sat idle for lack of mechanics, and cotton bolls browned on the stems. Across the state, from the Brazos River Basin to the Rio Grande Valley, the War Food Administration sounded the alarm. Without labor, harvests would rot. The solution arrived behind barbed wire. Under orders from Washington, the War Department authorized the controlled use of prisoner-of-war labor, guided by Article 27 of the Geneva Convention. Each man would be paid 80 cents per day, not in cash but in camp scrip redeemable for small comforts. Soon, convoys of olive-drab trucks rolled out of camps like Hearne, Swift, and Huntsville at dawn, filled with men in surplus khaki stenciled PW in black paint. They rode through the same dust clouds that once trailed cattle drives, their guards sitting easy on tailgates. When they reached the fields, the guards often leaned on fence posts while the Germans went to work. Under a 100-degree sky, they bent over rows of cotton and corn, swinging hoes with practiced rhythm. It was punishing work, but it carried a strange dignity, the chance to move, to sweat, to matter. For the Texans beside them, the surprise was mutual. These enemy soldiers discussed Goethe and engineering, sang folk songs as they picked, and repaired irrigation pumps with the precision of machinists. One farmer near Caldwell later told a reporter, "They were the best hands I ever had, and I never lost a tool." When the day's labor ended, distinctions blurred. Supervisors shared canteens or shaded tree breaks, conversations bridging the gulf of war with talk of weather, crops, and family. In camp, the prisoners spent their earnings on tobacco, chocolate, postcards, and sometimes watercolor paints. Many of those postcards, censored but unburned, carried the same astonished line home to Germany: "The Americans are strangely humane." Slowly, resentment softened into curiosity. What had begun as a labor contract evolved into a quiet cultural exchange, one fence post at a time. By autumn, a few Texans dared to test the rules, inviting their German workers to Sunday suppers and community picnics. One such gesture, offered beneath a stand of oaks and the scent of mesquite smoke, would ignite the most unlikely tradition of all, the Texas barbecue that welcomed its prisoners as guests. September 1944, Hearne, Texas. The late summer air was thick with the smell of mesquite smoke and dust, the kind that clung to denim and sweat. Beneath a sky bleached pale by heat, a rancher named Clyde Thompson stood beside a row of smoldering pits on his land west of town. Weeks earlier, a tornado had ripped through his property, tearing the roof from his barn and scattering his cattle fence into the creek. The men who helped rebuild it were not neighbors or hired hands. They were German prisoners from Camp Hearne. He had watched them work in silence, their discipline precise, their skill undeniable. His son was with the 36th Infantry Division fighting in Italy, but gratitude outweighed bitterness. When the job was done, Thompson made an unthinkable request. He wanted to host a barbecue for the men who had repaired what nature destroyed. Army officials hesitated. The idea of prisoners dining on private property bordered on insubordination to wartime order. Yet Hearne's commanding officer, perhaps sensing the harmlessness in the gesture, agreed, provided guards remained on site. And so on a September afternoon, 50 German POWs were trucked out under escort. The convoy's dust settled over oak trees and wire fences as ranch families gathered with folding tables and enamel plates. The air shimmered with heat and the slow rotation of beef sides over the flames. At first the Germans stood apart, arms stiff, waiting for insult or spectacle. Then a sergeant, once a rodeo cook before the war, handed one a plate with a nod. The prisoner hesitated, sniffed, and bit. The taste, charred crust, tangy sauce, soft bread, was unlike anything from Europe's hunger years. One man whispered, "It's a trick," but when seconds came, disbelief melted into laughter. Reporters from the Bryan Eagle wrote that Texas met the Reich with hospitality, not hatred, while letters to the editor denounced the event as indecent softness. Yet beneath the noise, something irreversible had begun. That afternoon showed both captors and captives that mercy could coexist with memory, that even amid global war, decency could still take a seat at the table. The fences would remain, but for the first time their purpose seemed thinner than the smoke that drifted above them. The experiment in humanity had begun, and it would not end in Hearne. By early 1945, the story of the Hearne barbecue had traveled far beyond Robertson County. Camp commanders heard it traded in letters, whispered among guards, and mentioned in the Dallas Morning News as a curiosity, a feast between enemies. Soon, other posts followed suit. At Camp Mexia, a detachment of captured paratroopers built their own pit from salvaged oil drums. In Huntsville, the mess sergeant organized a victory harvest cookout after the prisoners helped thresh wheat. At Camp Brady near San Angelo, soldiers and POWs worked side by side, turning beef quarters over glowing mesquite coals, the same kind of wood the Germans compared to oak in its steady burn. Everywhere the practice spread, oversight remained strict. Rifles slung, officers present, no civilians allowed inside without authorization. Yet the rules began to feel ceremonial. Guardrails for an event that had quietly rewritten its purpose. What might have been a disciplinary risk became an unlikely display of trust. The barbed wire still gleamed under the Texas sun, but inside it, the camps filled with laughter, music, and a peculiar sense of reprieve. Germans brought accordions and guitars. Americans tuned fiddles and harmonicas. Folk songs from the Rhine blended with frontier reels until melody erased nationality. On warm evenings, guards leaned on fence posts, tapping their boots, and sometimes, when the officers turned away, joined the dance. In one camp, prisoners carved a wooden sign that read "Texas Fire, Texas Festival." Beneath it, they roasted meat, served coffee, and traded slang with the locals who watched from outside the gate. For many Texans, it was their first time hearing fluent English, spoken in a German accent. Their first encounter with the enemy, as more than an image from newsreels. The women who passed plates through the wire saw politeness and gratitude where they had expected arrogance. The men they had been told were monsters spoke of homes, families, and ruined cities with the same sorrow any soldier might bear. For the prisoners, barbecue was more than food. It was revelation. The smoke, the tang of vinegar and spice, the easy generosity. It carried no bitterness, no propaganda. They called them Texan fire feasts in letters home, describing the smell as sweet and impossible to forget. Army intelligence reports, intended for Washington, noted something no manual had predicted. Morale among prisoners improved, escape attempts declined, and disciplinary incidents nearly vanished in camps that hosted these gatherings. Kindness had become a form of control. but also inadvertently a kind of diplomacy. The barbed wire and the brisket, symbols of war and welcome, had fused into one. What began as accident was now quiet policy, and its next expression would not come from smoke and flame, but from color and canvas. When German hands began to paint the America they were learning to understand. By late 1944, the clang of tools and the shuffle of marching boots in Texas POW camps were joined by quieter sounds: the scratch of pencils, the brush of paint against canvas, the murmur of voices reciting Goethe and Shakespeare. What had begun as an experiment in humane captivity had evolved into an education in civilization itself. The War Department, recognizing the success of recreation programs, encouraged cultural activities conducive to morale. Across Texas, the results were remarkable. In the barracks of Camp Hearne, Camp Huntsville, and Camp Mexia, German officers and enlisted men, who had once built bunkers, now built easels. Art clubs formed spontaneously, led by teachers, engineers, and artists drawn from across the Reich. At Camp Huntsville, a group of prisoners constructed a makeshift stage from lumber scavenged from supply crates. Before long, they performed Faust and the Barber of Seville to packed audiences of fellow prisoners and curious American officers. At Camp Hearne, a team of artists painted a sweeping mural along the mess hall wall, rolling Texas hills, red barns, and slow-moving rivers, scenes far removed from the heraldic eagles and iron crosses that once decorated their lives. They painted what they saw and what they had come to respect, one camp chaplain later wrote. For Texans who attended exhibitions, the experience was disorienting. These were the same men who had fought under Rommel, yet here they were painting sunsets and portraits of the Guards' children with aching realism. To the army, the results were measurable. Reports from the Provost Marshal General noted improved discipline, reduced anxiety, and a sharp drop in escape attempts. To the Germans, however, the transformation was more personal. Each stroke of color became an act of reflection, a therapy against homesickness, a confession of awe at a country they had been taught to despise. Through art, they began to see their captors not as conquerors but as human beings. What had started in smoke and brisket had now entered the realm of perception and philosophy. And as rumors of these civilized camps reached Europe, Nazi propagandists faced a bitter irony. Their soldiers were being re-educated not through punishment, but through kindness and beauty. Yet beneath the easy laughter and murals of open skies, another battle simmered, one fought not with rifles but with conviction. Among the thousands of German prisoners scattered across Texas were men who carried the Third Reich's creed like a second skin. Many were former SS troopers, Hitler youth instructors, or party loyalists steeped in years of indoctrination. To them, the friendliness of Americans was not magnanimity but manipulation, a soft weapon meant to dissolve loyalty to the Führer. As barbecues and art classes multiplied, these hardliners began to act. They organized secret camp courts, convened at night in barracks corners or shower rooms, where fellow prisoners were interrogated for signs of weakness. The charge of Kameradenschwein, comrade swine, became a death sentence. At Camp Hearne, the tension turned deadly. In late 1944, a prisoner known for exchanging letters with a young Texan woman was discovered hanging in the latrine. The official report listed it as suicide, but witnesses whispered otherwise. Military police found coded notes warning others against American contamination. The army moved quickly, separating ideological zealots from moderates. Dozens of known Nazis were shipped under guard to Fort Devens in Massachusetts and Camp Alva, Oklahoma, facilities designed to contain incorrigibles. Yet the damage within the ranks lingered. Those who had begun to see America with curiosity now lived under quiet fear. Even so, most refused to surrender the small freedoms they had earned. They continued painting, reading, and working, sustained by the same calm fairness that had first unsettled them. What struck many was not the abundance of America's resources, but the absence of hatred in its order. Sundays brought church bells, not propaganda marches. Families drove to picnics without police oversight. The enemy smiles, one letter home read, and still he wins. For men raised to believe in their nation's cultural superiority, this realization was more devastating than defeat. The American camps had become laboratories of contrast. where the strength of democracy was proven not by conquest, but by composure. That quiet psychological triumph would reshape thousands before they ever saw Europe again, setting the stage for what would happen when the war finally ended and the gates swung open. By early 1945, the reports reaching Washington carried an unexpected tone, not of discipline or defiance, but of transformation. What had begun as an exercise in logistics and security was turning into something far subtler. Across Texas, officers noted that prisoner morale was high, escape attempts rare, and cooperation almost complete. The War Department's Psychological Warfare Division studied the phenomenon closely. They called it the Intellectual Diversion Plan, a broad initiative that included lectures on democratic institutions, English classes, and film screenings about American life. Yet in Texas, no curriculum could rival what the locals had already mastered. Democracy was being taught not through pamphlets or podiums, but through the simple, disarming rituals of community, work shared, laughter exchanged, and barbecue served without bitterness. The newspapers gave it a name before the Army did: barbecue diplomacy. The Dallas Morning News ran an editorial praising the Texan genius for decency, claiming it was defeating Nazism more efficiently than bullets. On the ground, that wasn't far from truth. POWs who once whispered Nazi slogans were now writing home about the civility of their captors and the fairness of American guards. The contrast was profound. After years of totalitarian control, they saw a society that trusted its own citizens, and even its enemies, with dignity. The lesson landed deeper than any propaganda broadcast. For Texans, too, the effect was undeniable. The sight of uniformed Germans helping in harvests, carving wooden toys for local children, or bowing in thanks at the end of a shared meal, dissolved abstract hatred into reluctant empathy. The barbed wire no longer symbolized vengeance, but containment of the war itself, a boundary around the worst of humanity, not between it. And as April brought news of Allied advances in Europe, the smell of mesquite smoke still hung over campyards, a final ritual of fellowship before parting. The same flames that once cooked for prisoners would soon feed friends preparing to go home. Proof that sometimes peace is won not at the negotiating table, but around a fire. May 1945, victory thundered across Europe, and with it came the sound of trains pulling from Texas sidings. At Camp Hearne, Mexia, and Huntsville, thousands of German prisoners gathered their belongings. Duffel bags patched with scraps of army canvas, sketchbooks tied with string, folded photographs of Texans they now called friends. When the loudspeaker announced the orders for repatriation, many stood motionless. Home, once a word of longing, had become uncertain terrain. As the convoys rolled east toward ports in New York and New Orleans, some prisoners wept openly. They were leaving behind not merely captivity, but an unlikely education in humanity. In their pockets they carried keepsakes, hand-carved toys, snapshots of smiling guards, and in more than a few cases, handwritten recipes for Texas barbecue sauce, carefully copied in phonetic English. Over 10,000 would write back once they reached Europe. The letters, preserved in archives and family attics, spoke in a tone the war had nearly erased: gratitude. They thanked their captors for justice without hate, for coffee served on cold mornings, for laughter that had made defeat bearable. Some correspondences lasted years. A few became lifelong friendships. One former prisoner, Hans Kruger, returned to Hearne in 1961, walking the old campgrounds now covered in grass. He stood over the remains of the barbecue pit and told a local reporter, "This is where I learned what freedom feels like." In post-war Germany, these men became quiet envoys of another America, not the one of bombers and occupation, but of civility and fairness. They told their children that the first democracy they had ever encountered had existed behind barbed wire. For Texans, those letters became proof that kindness carried strategic weight, that decency could ripple farther than power. As the Cold War dawned, policymakers and pastors alike pointed to Texas as evidence that moral strength could outlast military might. Yet not every camp closed in harmony. Bitterness lingered in a few, a reminder that even the warmest fire leaves behind ash. Still, the smoke that once rose over Hearne had already done its work. It had drifted across the ocean, carrying the scent of reconciliation. When the trains reached Bremerhaven and Hamburg in the winter of 1946, the men who stepped off them were not the same soldiers who had left Germany years before. They returned to a nation hollowed by defeat, cities flattened, institutions discredited, families fractured. Yet within the rubble lay an inheritance few expected, the lessons learned behind barbed wire under the Texas sun. Many former prisoners, once engineers, teachers, or craftsmen, brought back methods and ideals borrowed from the American camps: efficiency without cruelty, cooperation without fear. They had seen democracy not in theory but in practice, guards who followed rules without arrogance, civilians who offered respect without submission, and communities that thrived on trust instead of command. Across Bavaria, Württemberg and Hesse, those ideas took root quietly. Returning POWs helped organize village councils, school boards, and farmers' cooperatives, modeled on the fairness they had witnessed in the American South. One ex-prisoner from Camp Hearne later wrote that he had learned more about freedom from Texans than from any book. The Texas spirit, as they called it, came to mean practical decency, the belief that authority could serve, not dominate. In towns like Kassel and Ulm, summer gatherings soon featured an unlikely symbol of that spirit: barbecues patterned after those once shared between captors and captives. Smoke rose over war-torn fields, this time as a celebration of peace, not labor. For Texans, the memories lingered just as deeply. Families kept wood carvings, letters, and murals made by men they once guarded. They spoke of the Germans who could fix any engine, who painted sunsets on barracks walls, who said "thank you" in accented English. The experiment had ended, but its moral endured. That strength is not measured by domination but by restraint, and that mercy can outlive conflict. In the decades that followed, as America and West Germany stood together through the Cold War, the friendship born in those Texas camps became a quiet foundation for alliance. Proof that even in war, humanity can choose to rebuild with memory rather than revenge. History remembers war through its smoke, cities burning, engines roaring, skies blackened by the exhaust of destruction. Yet in Texas, a different kind of smoke once rose, thinner and sweeter, curling above mesquite pits and drifting over fields of cotton and oak. For the German prisoners who had expected cruelty and found kindness instead, that scent became unforgettable. It was not the smoke of ruin but of revelation, the realization that mercy could be policy, that compassion could defeat ideology without a single shot fired. In the quiet cadence of American life, meals shared, rules kept, dignity given, they discovered a strength their own system had never taught them: the power of calm conviction. When those men went home, they carried that memory like an ember. They spoke of America not as conqueror, but as neighbor, describing the people who had fed them, laughed with them, and allowed them to feel human when the rest of the world saw only uniforms. Long before formal reconciliation, those stories traveled across oceans, softening hearts where diplomacy could not reach. The camps are gone now, fences rusted, foundations buried under pasture grass, but the legacy remains in the air. On still evenings in Hearne, when the sun drops low and the wind turns warm, locals say you can still smell oak and mesquite, faint but real, like a whisper from history. It carries the memory of a night when enemies sat together, ate together, and if only for an hour, rediscovered what peace could taste like. The war had taken nearly everything, but in Texas it briefly gave something back: the smoke that stayed.